I'm closing out a conference that's centered around psychology with some nerdy economist math. My name is Kalinda Ukanwa. I'm assistant professor, as just was mentioned, at Marshall School of Business. I'm a quantitative modeler. Most of my research is on algorithmic fairness and bias, and so I'm going to talk about a paper, why firms should want algorithmic accountability. This is a paper that's co-authored with Peter Zubczak and Bill Rand. And by the way, I want to thank Nate Fass, Neely Center, the organizers of this conference, for inviting me to participate. I'm excited to be here. Okay, I'm getting used to this. So just to give you a sense of who is this woman up here, what's she doing here, what does she do? As I mentioned, I do work on algorithmic fairness, responsible AI. If you think of what is responsible AI, it's about principles that make AI safer while supporting and extracting all the benefits of AI. If you think about, I have an analogy with the invention of the car. It was a great transformative technology, but we needed things like seat belts, roadways, stoplights to make it safer so that we can extract the benefits. And so that's the way to think about responsible AI, and algorithmic fairness is definitely one of those principles. This is some of the work that I've done, but today, as I mentioned, the top one is going to be about fairness. So Carrie did a great job of explaining what algorithmic bias is, so I'm not going to go too much into what that definition is. But here are some headlines that give some examples of how it impacts people. And much of my research is about how does it impact consumers, what should firms do as a downstream effect. I'm going to center as an example this, what you see up here, this credit card, the Apple credit card, which gives an example of what this paper is about. So back in 2019, for those who are not familiar with this, started with a couple tweets. Ironically, one of them was from Steve Wozniak, who's the co-founder of Apple, where they accused the algorithm behind the credit card of being biased against women. Why did they come to this conclusion? Because they had applied for the card, their wives had applied for the card, but the outcomes were very different, where they got much more favorable terms than their wives. There were a lot of other people who responded to these tweets, saying the same thing happened to me. Before you know, there was a viral belief that the algorithm was biased against women. What's ironic, where even if you know the story, you may not know as much about the follow-up. So New York State regulators investigated as a result of these viral tweets for whether there was evidence of bias. Nearly 2 years later, they came out with a report where they said that they examined almost 400,000 records of applications and found no evidence of bias. So it raises some interesting questions, which is, how could this belief arise if there's no evidence of bias? How did this happen? And what were some of the effects of the report that came out from the New York State regulators? Did it reduce or increase? Because this has real-world implications not only for consumers, but also for the firms. For quite a while, people believed because it was biased, it discouraged some people from applying for the credit card, especially women. Keep hitting the wrong button. Sorry. Okay. So there has been some legislation that has been introduced or proposed by governments to help protect in situations like this. There's certainly GDPR, and then the new Artificial Intelligence Act in Europe, and then in the United States, there's a bill that has not been passed, at least last I checked, which is the Algorithmic Accountability Act. Now, this kind of legislation and others that are out there, they have this one common theme, which is they rely on collaborative governance. And what I mean by that is that it's relying on stakeholders working together to address these issues. So they assume that firms are tasked with making algorithms that are going to reduce the bias they may produce, and then be responsive to people, their consumers, when they raise the red flag. But it also relies on consumers as a group to be the ones to raise the red flag in the first place. That could be in terms of complaining to customer support, all the way to suing, litigation. There's a challenge and creates a tension as a result of this reliance that might create an unintentional consequence of this kind of legislation, and that is that there's two things. One, firms have access to all the data, but the average consumer like you and me, we don't have access to 400,000 records, so we can't tell. Number two, most consumers, no matter how educated they are, may not understand the inner workings of an algorithm. And even if they are somebody who is a designer of algorithms, may not understand the inner workings of that algorithm, like Goldman Sachs. The other thing, and I think this is even more profound, personally, is that how a firm may assess fairness might be very different from how a consumer assesses fairness. So in the algorithmic fairness literature, even though there's no general consensus, in general, standards of fairness are based on statistical parity. And what that means is that the same percentage in this example of men and women get credit cards. Now, it might be conditional on being creditworthy, conditional on something else, but the same percentage of men and women get the same outcome. Now, statistical parity requires data, access to lots of information, but as the average consumer, there's plenty of literature that has shown that consumers rely on their social networks. You think about the example I just gave, they're relying on people that they know. So it raises some practical questions. How do consumers form beliefs about algorithmic fairness? What happens when consumers' beliefs do not align with firm standards of algorithmic fairness? And with greater AI accountability, think of the New York regulators who reported out to people, help or hurt firms in such conditions as these. So as I mentioned, consumers, plenty of research in the past has shown consumers' perceptions of fairness are often driven by who we know, our culture, our society, who's in our social networks. And that's where we get our social news. And then there's also plenty of research that's shown that as human beings, we rely on local heuristics, and we rely on valence, as opposed to the certainty of information that we get, rely on what's the valence of that information, and to make these kind of judgments. So what we wanted to understand, my co-authors and I, are, well, given that this is how we think and how beliefs can arise from that, what could possibly happen if we were to computationally model this, simulate the spread of beliefs? Under what conditions, when you have this dichotomy between standards of fairness between an individual and the firm, could you have a spread of unfairness beliefs around an algorithm, whether the algorithm was truly fair in terms of statistical parity, which is what firms use, or not. We also wanted to understand under what conditions could that trajectory of the belief spread if you had a third-party institution, what we're going to call a watchdog, that regularly monitors an algorithm, reports out its performance to everybody. How does that affect beliefs? And then ultimately, we want to understand from a firm standpoint, under what conditions is it beneficial versus not to have this third party? So we use a complex contagion model. And basically, the best way to think about this is a computational model that simulates a world where you have consumers who are interacting with a service. This service, this firm, is using an algorithm to provide service to people. And this algorithm is not perfect. Occasionally, it's going to make service errors, which have nothing to do with bias or algorithmic bias from the firm. So these are random errors that might hit anybody in general. We simulate in here a world where there's two groups. You know, you can think of it as a historically marginalized group and a group that is non-historically marginalized who are consumers. And we simulate, in some cases, a world where there's also a firm that is a third-party watchdog. Because we want to understand how do these beliefs arise when there's a fair algorithm versus a non-fair algorithm, and how do these beliefs arise when there's a watchdog there versus not a watchdog. In this particular computational model, we make some assumptions about the rate of service error. How often will an algorithm make just random mistakes? How often will an algorithm make biased outcomes because it's biased against one particular group? And we also randomize how often or how susceptible people are to adopting beliefs of their neighbors, as well as adopting beliefs from the third-party watchdog if they see information based on that. So here are some of our findings. On the x-axis is service failure rate. So what percentage of people randomly get mistreated by the algorithm? On the y-axis is a measure of what percentage of the population believes that the algorithm is unfair. And what we find, here's some insights that we find. So one, even when there is no algorithmic bias in the algorithm, so the algorithm is not biased according to corporate standards, unfairness beliefs can arise. It can arise because of the service failure rate, these random service failures that might lead to people ultimately igniting beliefs that is unfair. That might have been the case with the Apple Card, that's speculation, but that could explain how that can arise. When there's no watchdog and the service failure rates are high enough, often consumers will have trouble distinguishing between a fair and unfair algorithm. If you think about detecting whether a firm is using a fair algorithm or not. And keep in mind, consumers are responsible for raising the red flag according to legislation. Third, the presence of a watchdog has these separating beliefs. You now introduce the third party, reports out, helps consumers to better distinguish. Now this next graph shows watchdog, the strength of the watchdog versus unfairness beliefs. So the way to think about the x-axis is what percentage of people is the watchdog reaching and convincing more. So to the right, it's stronger. And so we find that a firm with a biased algorithm, under certain conditions, can be perceived by people to be more fair than a second firm that has an unbiased algorithm but makes more errors. So now there can be cases where people may not be able to distinguish between the two. Increasing algorithmic accountability in terms of the strength of the watchdog, of course, reverses this pattern. And unfairness beliefs, we find increase even faster if the algorithmic bias rate is even higher than the error rate. One more thing. How much time? 2 minutes. Okay. So we also wanted to understand within a social network who's most impacted by the watchdog. So this is a graph that's supposed to represent a social network where you can think of the center as those who are most well-connected, most influential, and as you get further out, they have less connections, there are less people that they're connected to. So we find that those in the center who are most well-connected are the ones that are least impacted by the watchdog. So why is that? Because they have the most on-the-ground information. They see what's happening, especially with minorities, in this particular, historically marginalized, and so they're least impacted by the watchdog. And so for a watchdog to work, they have to work particularly hard to be convincing or truthful and trustworthy to the population of those who are historically marginalized in order to convince the population. Two, we find that for isolated nodes, those who are at the outside, they have moderate impact, but those who are most impacted are those who have a mid-moderate level of connections, because those are the ones who have some information but are most changed by watchdog. Okay, so I'm going to skip through this, and so let me get to the concrete conclusions. And so what are some of the takeaways through this? We're motivated by both classification problems with algorithms where they're classifiers. There's some inherent trade-offs in terms of what's labeled as fair and unfair. One of the key things is, are we judging things by the same standards when we're a consumer versus a firm, which can lead to some different perceptions of what is fair and unfair. And such definitions, maybe a court is using what we call statistical parity, but we need to take into consideration how consumers judge fairness in this equation. And so we learned that if we have a third-party watchdog, it's most beneficial to firms when you have, the fairer your algorithm is. Watchdog can amplify and inform the population if there is unfairness. So it's a way for the population to detect when the bias is happening and help amplify those beliefs. And so what we intend in terms of our contribution from this particular work is to show how fairness beliefs propagate over word of mouth, and how analyzing this through algorithmic accountability reveals conditions where it can actually be beneficial for firms. Even though firms tend to back away from monitoring, it could be of quite benefit if you have an algorithm that's fair, and maybe can introduce conditions that help to provide that feedback to improve that fairness through word of mouth. And with that, I'll stop here.